This article refers to some thinking on how Christians should defend certain doctrines. It looks at the fact that in the past, Christians have defended fiercely a doctrine or a teaching that actually has very little warrant in the Bible, and that can lead to quite embarrassing consequences. One can think of the doctrine of abstinence, the temperance movement, and the way it eventually led to the prohibition. In truth, the temperance societies of the 19th century achieved a lot of good, and one could argue that the modern tourist industry owes its origins to Thomas Cook and his desire to provide an alternative to drinking in the pubs by having people go on package holidays. Or you might think of the Premiership football clubs that were established very often as football teams by churches, again to provide an incentive to get people out of the pubs. So the temperance movement has an honourable history, but obviously in the 1920s it turned into prohibition in America, which humiliated the evangelical church. And there is very little scriptural warrant for that type of abstinence. But if we kind of look at other issues, such as the issue of the Nicene Creed and Athanasius in the 4th century, we see that Athanasius defended the Nicene Creed when the entire establishment wanted him to compromise with Arian and come up with a way of describing Jesus which was less than the idea of him being equally God with the Father. But Athanasius would not step down on this issue, and in the end, the phrase was coined Athanasius versus the world, because it appeared the entire world was against Athanasius, and he was exiled a number of times as a bishop of Alexandria. But in the end, Athanasius won. Another great example was Luther in the defense of justification by faith and the priesthood of all believers. Both times, both doctrines were assailed by the establishment and by the church of the time, but Luther persevered, and those who supported him also persevered, often at the cost of their lives. But the truth was prevailed, and it was wonderfully supported by Scripture, just as Athanasius' truth of the equality of Jesus with God was wonderfully supported by Scripture. So the question would be, well, are there modern examples where we haven't defended an important biblical truth, rather than being a side issue like the abstinence from alcohol? Well, the important biblical truth that we have failed to defend is that God is creator. Again, one really has to be blind not to see how many times this doctrine is taught in the Bible. God is the creator. Starts at the very beginning, but it's repeatedly mentioned in the Psalms, it's repeatedly mentioned in Isaiah, and it's an important doctrine. But we didn't defend it in the 19th century when geologists said the world was hundreds of millions of years old, and when ultimately, in the middle of the 19th century, the theory of evolution came about. And because the church did not defend the doctrine of God as creator, it's no surprise that church attendance begins to start to diminish, and then rapidly diminishes as secularization and scientism takes hold in the latter half of the 20th century. And what are the consequences for that, for our current issues? Well, one of the current issues is sexual ethics. What do we think about sexual ethics? Do we go with the times? Do we say that this is a side issue, in the way that many evangelicals think creation is a side issue? But actually, if you go to Romans chapter 1, you will see very clearly that if you reject God as creator, sexual ethics will ultimately be undermined. And we see today the undermining of sexual ethics from the biblical standpoint. And marriage, we start in Genesis chapter 2, effectively with the first marriage, and it runs all the way to the end of Revelation, where you have the marriage supper of the Lamb. Surely marriage is a very important part of the Bible and its teaching. And so these aren't side issues, creation and marriage. They are important issues. And so I would say the church ought to defend them just as Luther defended justification by faith, just as Athanasius defended the equality of Jesus with God the Father. These are not side issues like the abstinence from alcohol. I leave that as a thought, and I think it's really important that the church makes up its mind about what are the important issues and be careful not to dismiss as side issues something that God considers to be very important. Well, thank you for listening.